Hello all, and welcome to this Polygence webinar. It's my pleasure to welcome you. My name is GP LeBourdais, the head of strategic initiatives here at Polygence, and we are just delighted to have all of you join us for this headline webinar of our spring webinar series. In addition to being a program for students, Polygence is also a community. We are a group of researchers, of rising scholars, and of educators, including the many educational consultants we work with who are here today. And we're just delighted to have Jennifer Wallace join us today, just to remind us to keep students at the center of what we do, but also to tell us about specific ways that we can make sure that they are best supported in this crazy journey that is adolescence into adulthood. I'd love to introduce Jenny briefly, but before I do, I want to let everybody know that we are excited to have a really enriching and helpful conversation today, but we also want to hear your questions specifically. So please feel free to enter in your questions into the Q&A, and we will make sure, especially to identify themes that bubble to the top so that Jenny can address them directly. And also, just to get a sense of where everyone is, feel free to tell us where you're joining us from in the chat if you like. So Jennifer Wallace is an award-winning journalist and author of a New York Times best-selling book, Never Enough: When Achievement Pressure Becomes Toxic and What We Can Do About It, the subject really of our talk today. She's a contributor to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and appears on national television to discuss her articles and relevant topics in the news. She's a BCG Bright House luminary and consultant with the LEGO Group. And she also serves on the board of the Coalition for the Homeless in New York City, where she lives with her husband and their 3 children. Jenny, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you all. Thanks for joining and thanks for having me.
Just to jump right into this book, we know that this is something that you have been doing an amazing press tour for over more than a year now. Really just having this really important message reach so many different communities and so many different parents. But we would love to hear from you, because you spent so much time researching and writing this book. What brought you to this topic? How did you arrive on this notion of achievement pressure?
So, as you mentioned, I'm a reporter, but I'm also the mother of 3 teenagers. And I was noticing over the years just how different my kids' childhood was from my own growing up. It felt so much more competitive. And then in 2019, I wrote an article for the Washington Post where I was reporting on 2 national policy reports, one by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the other, the National Academies of Sciences. And these researchers were looking at students young people actually, who were at risk for negative health outcomes. And so they identified groups like children living in poverty, children with incarcerated parents, children of recent immigrants with few resources, children living in foster care. And then they named a new at-risk group, children attending what the researchers were calling high-achieving schools. Those are public and private schools around the country where kids go off to competitive 4-year colleges. The researchers were finding that these kids were now at risk, meaning they were 2 to 6 times more likely to suffer from clinical levels of anxiety and depression, and 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse disorder than the average American teen. And these were my own kids that I was writing about. My kids attend one of these high achieving schools, as they're termed. And so I wanted to find out, what could I do in my own home to buffer against what the researchers were calling an excessive pressure to achieve.
Yes, and I remember in the book you say, quite rightly identifying there are all of these other groups that are at risk. Why would these kids, who presumably have the world served to them on a silver platter, be encountering these difficulties? And it has so much to do with, I think, with us as parents and as educators. Um, in addition to all of the experts you talked to, I know that you spoke to a lot of different families, a lot of different parents who are going through the trenches of raising young people. How did you find these different families? What led you to them?
Yeah, so the research was pretty extensive for this book. I conducted 2 large national surveys. One, with the help of a researcher at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, we surveyed 6,500 parents around the country because I wanted to know, is this a feeling that's just being felt on the coasts or in a few select communities? And what I found in this national survey is that these pressures were being felt everywhere. I heard from parents in Alaska. I heard from parents in Omaha. I heard from parents from, basically almost every state. And then for 3 years, I traveled the country, and I met with parents in their kitchens, in their minivans, at moms and dads' nights out. And what I was hearing was a common refrain. I pulled a few things that I asked from the survey that I thought could be relevant to our conversation today. So I asked parents how much they agreed or disagreed with statements like, parents in my community generally agree that getting into a selective college is one of the most important ingredients for later life success. 80% of the parents that I surveyed agreed with that statement. Then I asked them how much, again, did they agree or disagree with statements like, I feel responsible for my children's achievement and success. 75% of parents agreed with that statement. And this statement that I asked, others think that my children's academic success is a reflection of my parenting. 83% of parents agreed with that statement. So what I was hearing over and over again was that modern parents felt caught. They wanted to enjoy being a parent. They wanted their kids to have the kind of childhood that they could look back on with nostalgia in the years to come. And yet they felt responsible for making their kids a success, for setting them up for a successful future. And so anyway, these parents were very open with me, and I'm just so grateful. So their stories are throughout the book, and they were extremely generous and forthcoming about the pressures they were feeling.
Yes. And as a parent of two small children now, I can already feel those pressures coming on. I want to provide them with the best possible array of opportunities. And at the same time, you also, as you mentioned with that last stat, people feeling that they are implicitly judged sort of by a transitive property, that it's my students, my kids' success is a reflection of my own qualities as a parent. And so I'm sort of wondering, could you talk a little bit more about that balancing act and wanting students, wanting to give people opportunities, wanting our children to achieve, and at the same time not boiling over, so to speak, into
Yeah.
that toxic area?
So I think what's important for parents, and what I really set out to do in this book, is to zoom out. We tend to very much personalize our own experience instead of putting it into context. And, when we were growing up, or at least true of me, I'm 52, when I was growing up in the 70s and the early 80s, life was generally more affordable. Housing was more affordable, healthcare was more affordable, higher education was more affordable. There was slack in the system. So my parents could be relatively assured that even with a B minus in AP calculus that I got, that most likely I'd be able to replicate my own childhood, if not do even better than my own parents did. But modern parents, we are facing a different reality. We are seeing the first generation, the millennials, who on average are not doing as well as their parents. We have watched over the last several decades steep inequality come ushered in. We feel the hyper competition that globalization has brought. And, while it's always been the job of a parent to raise a child who will thrive when we are no longer around to guide them, never has that future that we're preparing our kids for felt so uncertain or so fraught. I mean, we don't know what something like 40% of the jobs are going to be when our kids are out on the job market.
Right.
What are we even preparing them for? And so what I heard over and over again in my interviews, and this wasn't necessarily explicitly said to me, it was more implicit in our conversations, but it was that parents are betting big, that early childhood success, getting their kids into a quote unquote good college, they hope will act as a kind of life vest in a sea of economic uncertainty. But what I found over and over again in my conversations, and what those two national policy reports were pointing out, is that that life vest is acting more like a leaded vest for too many of the kids that we are trying to protect. And there is a better way.
Yeah. One of the more poignant stories that I remember from the book as well was about a young woman. I believe she went to Duke and she went to law school, got a great job at a law firm. And it was really only in her late 30s when she felt like she should have made it by now, that she just felt the weight of all of these years of achievement pressure come crashing down. And it led to, really her needing to repair her relationship with her parents, sort of tracing all of these habits and impulses to the kinds of messages that her parents were sending. So I try to keep that in mind too. It's not just getting them out the door at 18, it's really setting them up to be people who can thrive, to use your word, in the world after they're no longer living with us.
And I would like to, in this book, I defend parents because I have been reading the parenting books that have come out over the last 10 years or so, and they are very quick to blame parents. And
Mm,
I dug into the research, and what I say in the book, and I firmly believe, is that this intensive parenting that we are seeing today is not a psychological problem on the, of the parents of this generation. Instead, we are reacting to a sociological problem. We are sensing fewer and fewer safety nets for our kids. And so, in the words of one sociologist, Melissa Milkey, that I interviewed, she said intensive parenting is actually creating individualized safety nets for each one of our kids. So, we don't live in a society that has a lot of guarantees. And so, it is up to the parents, most often the mothers, to weave those social safety nets for our kids. And so, yes, I don't blame parents. It also doesn't let us off the hook, right? We need to be aware of the messages in our wider environment. We need to be examining those messages and seeing if they're actually true. And if they are not true, we need to be pointing it out to our kids and buffering against them. So as much as yes, we parents, we have to be aware of our parenting behavior, but I want parents to know, if they're watching right now, that it's not that parents are making these decisions to parent intensively alone in their living rooms. We are reacting to some pretty extraordinary macroeconomic forces that our parents did not have to face. But again, it doesn't let us off the hook. But I just want to give context to parents so that I do believe it's with that context, it's with zooming out, that allows us to really look at our behavior from a distance and not personalize it so much.
yes,
And
thank you. Yeah, I think that I'm really glad that you reminded us all of that. And I think this will connect to some of the really, I think, promising and hopeful ideas around the mattering movement that I hope to get to a little later in the conversation. But in the spirit of zooming out as well and addressing the sociological pressures that have changed from generation to generation, that have in many ways created this environment that we're all living in now. Um, Polygence is really a program for students to identify things that they're passionate about and to prepare for college. And we see all the time students coming to us with the expectation that they want to publish a research paper, that they want to get into an Ivy League school, that they want to go to the best law school, and so forth. And so a lot of those pressures are very front of mind for us. Could you talk about specifically the sort of this change generationally in the pressure to go to a top college and how that manifested in some of your conversations?
well, when I was applying out to colleges, I went to Harvard. It was an 18% acceptance rate. It was basically a sign up sheet. Today, it's a 3% acceptance rate. And so, honestly, in the book, at the end of the book, I talk about tips for families, for educators, even for higher education. And I think that, I think somebody just asked about the sociological problem. One of the issues that I think colleges are going to have to address, and that Daniel Markovits, who is a Yale Law School professor, he wrote a fabulous book called The Meritocracy Trap. And he argues in the book that colleges like my alma mater, Harvard, have not expanded their class in 30 plus years when I was attending. And yet our endowments have ballooned. And so he argues in the book, and I kind of agree with this, that we need to start holding our colleges, our alma maters accountable. That if they are going to benefit from the nonprofit status and the tax breaks that they get, then they better start operating like social mobility engines. And so what I'm saying here is, and this is Daniel Markowitz's argument, that one of the ways we can address this is by expanding classes. We have so many more qualified students around the world applying to the top 30, top 50 colleges. There is no reason why we can't be looking at creative ways. And there are schools that are looking at it. Princeton is examining it to really expand their class. It's time to get creative. It's time to educate more kids because we have so many more qualified children, young people out there applying to these schools.
Yes. Some of the research that we also do internally at Polygence is to understand what exactly the return on investment, so to speak. A lot of parents are thinking about, I'm spending all of this money to do all these extracurriculars, to send the kids to a great school. I want to be assured that we can set up that economic safety net for them and be reasonably confident that our kids will either do better than we are or still have the same quality of life that we have brought them up in. And some of the really interesting results there are, yes, it definitely seems, of course, that the benefits of an Ivy League degree do confer some networking and some price premiums for students who enter the workforce. But we did a really great study of some research from a Dartmouth prof now at USC who found actually you don't need an Ivy League degree to be a CEO. You're more likely not to have one
Right.
and be the executive of a big, important company.
That's
And
right.
you,
There's been several studies, not just yours. I mean, your study points this out, but I have other research in the book that has found the exact same thing. I think as a society, we've taken our eye off the ball and
mm,
we believe a credential, a logo is what's going to make our kids a success. But the research finds that it's the student. It's not the brand of the
right.
college that actually leads to that later life success. But I didn't mean to interrupt you. Just wanted to point out
Oh, I'm so glad you did. Yes.
there's lots of research on this.
Because the more good research people hear, the better.
Yes, I totally
Yes.
agree. And as a parent of a senior, um, what I started doing after absorbing all this research and writing about it on what actually does lead to the career success, the financial success, the well-being that we want for our kids when they graduate college, when they go out into the real world. And what the research points to is that it is how a student goes to college, not where a student goes to college, that leads to that later life success. And I don't know if you are familiar with this research, the Purdue Index, the Gallup Purdue Index,
Hmm.
where they really focused on it was led by a researcher named John Pryor, who's done research out of UCLA, Dartmouth, and he is wonderful. He's done a lot of research on this area, and actually, the 6 key experiences on that college campus that lead to success can happen at any college. And it's having a professor that knows you as more than just a student, who cares about your goals, having the opportunity to apply what you're learning in the classroom out into the real world through internships, through summer jobs, through multi-semester projects. It's being a part of an extracurricular activity that gives you a grounding, a sense of belonging and connection, and also being depended on by that organization to add value back to the college campus, either through entertainment, if you're in a play or playing an intramural sport, whatever it is. So it's really how a student goes to college. And we have dropped the ball on educating young people about that. And you pointed out earlier in the conversation about some of the young people that I met and I interviewed, and a lot of them go off to these top colleges and they crash and burn.
Mm.
And, I think if we parents and educators could talk about what it is about the college experience that leads to these better outcomes, I think we could prevent a lot of the crash and burning. that comes from not knowing what you're achieving for, right? The crashing and burning
Right.
is because they are just caring about their resume, that self-focused lens that sets them up for a real, real mental health struggles when they get to the college campus.
Yes. I just wanted to share our white paper on this topic that I've just entered into the chat there that actually includes some other great research, including an interview with a great clinical psychotherapist who works with, based in New York, who works with a lot of parents and teens about this issue. And her quote was that really the single most important thing that she thinks that parents can provide their children is a sense of, and this goes to the heart of what I want to invite you to speak about in a moment, the mattering movement, but to identify a passion that allows them to have an identity beyond school, to make them feel like they want to make a difference in the world in such a way that it doesn't matter if they go to this school or that school. Their horizon for making a difference goes far beyond the name on the sweatshirt that they happen to be wearing. So could you speak a little bit about how that connects with the Mattering movement, getting students to zoom out and to look at that horizon where they can make a difference?
Yes.
Would love to hear about this.
So I let me start by saying I interviewed William Damon, who is a scholar at Stanford, and he is a scholar on purpose in young people. And what he found is in his research, and he talked to me about, I interviewed him for my book. He said he believes that young people are struggling today, not so much because we are overscheduling them or overworking them, but rather because they don't know what they're working for. And so helping people, young people, turn that self-focused lens outward and actually have explicit conversations about why do we why do we have to learn how to write so well? Why do we have to learn how to do research papers? Why do we have to learn how to present findings of a study? It's funny because I go and I speak at a lot of high schools, and students have never had these conversations. When I ask them, why do we go to school? Why do we work so hard? Why do we have to be good communicators and good writers and understand math and all of these things? And they don't know why. They think it's for their resumes, they think it's for college. And so with the Mattering movement, what I've done is I've co-founded it with long-term educators. And it is schools who have read the book are asking for more resources. And so we have created a first of its kind curriculum that is going into schools and helping young people locate genuine needs in their community. So, and then finding what their strengths are and showing them how to bridge, how to apply those strengths to places in the world that need their help. So one school that I visited that I write about in the book, St. Ignatius in Cleveland, Ohio, they do something that I think anybody could apply. Any school could apply this. And certainly I started doing this in my own home, that for 2 minutes every day at 2 o'clock, the lights go off in the school. And over the loudspeaker, students or faculty or staff members talk about a need in the world. One of the days I was there, they talked about how families living in poverty were disproportionately impacted by climate change. And it wasn't a lecture. It wasn't saying now you have to go do something about it. It was simply raising an awareness. So one of the things that I did was I brought that idea home to my dinner table with my kids. My husband and I are very good about talking about current events, but we weren't great about talking about needs in the world. And so we live in New York City, and it was at the start of the migrant crisis here, where people were coming from South America into a cold winter in New York without coats and hats and gloves. And so we were talking about this at the table, and I said, I feel so bad for these parents who are bringing their kids into New York, and they can't even take them to the playground because it's so cold and they don't have the clothes. And my teenagers were like, well, we should do something about this. We should go into our closets. We should grab our hats and gloves and our coats that don't fit us anymore and drop them off at the hotels where these people were being housed. And I thought to myself, wow, how many times have I said to my teenagers, okay, it's the school year. You need to clean out your closets and make room for the clothes that are going to fit you this year, right? And what I wasn't doing was matching, was I wasn't pointing out a genuine need and allowing them to come up with ways. It's a small, simple story, but really it represented a big shift. As opposed to me saying, clean out your closets of the clothes that don't fit, drop the coat off at the lobby of your school for the coat drive. Instead, I was showing them genuine need and listening to them brainstorm ways to meet that need. So that to me is something that we are not as deliberate as we can be in helping kids locate genuine needs in their community. It could be in their own school community. It could be in their neighborhood. It can be in the wider community. So at the Mattery movement, we have tools. I'll tell you one other, if I could tell you a quick story about a
Please.
school, Trinity School in New York City. One of my co-founders started the Office of Public Service there, and where she was for 10 years. She was creating a curriculum around community service. And so she got there. And one of the reasons she was brought into Trinity was because they were seeing this excessive pressure and this over focus on resume building. And so the first semester she got there, she said to the students, okay, there's a school across the street, an elementary school. And I think that could be a place where we could maybe do some volunteer work. What do you think we could do at that school? And most of the students said, well, we should go and tutor. And she said, well, do they need tutoring? And they were like, well, that's how we can add value. And she said, you know what, let's go to the school and let's ask them what they actually need. And so she brought in groups. They met with the head of the school, and the head of the school said, actually, what we need is help at the lunch tables. It's the same hour that all the teachers are eating lunch at the same time, and we have one monitor, lunch lady monitor, and she could really use the help. So if one student could be at every table, that would really go a long way. Well, the students were like, well, this is kind of lame. I don't know how I'm going to actually be adding value just by sitting at a cafeteria table. But actually what they saw was not only were they sitting at the table, they were answering questions that the students had about where should I recycle? Where should I do this? Helping them with homework if they were, struggling with a problem, and helping them bridge, arguments that might come up at the cafeteria table. And what these students realized was that they actually met a genuine need, which was to help, prevent chaos in the cafeteria, to
Right.
teach about, recycling, et cetera. And so it's a simple thing, but I think it's something in our world that we're not always attuned to what the real needs are in the situation. For us to feel like we matter, it's filling those genuine needs. It's not necessarily what we want to be doing, but rather what the other person needs from us.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it. I think it's quick. As someone who loves to jump to solutions very quickly, I know that it's been a learning curve even for me to, whether it be directly in my family or with the students I'm working with, to try to say, let's jump right to this thing that I know I can solve this problem for you. But really what they want most often is just someone to speak with and to be a confidant. In many ways, I'm sure these students were also very inspiring for this elementary school class at lunch. Having bigger people there to basically be with you and to listen to you and to validate your feelings and thoughts, that goes a long way to building those relationships and inspiring the next generation. Um, so one of the themes that's sort of come up is over focusing on the most selective schools in our dialogue, and one of the other things we've been wondering about too is to think about uplifting those other schools that might be amazing places for students to study, but that aren't the most competitive or selective or prestigious, so to speak. You might have noted, there are lots of other great rubrics that places are using. The New York Times, for one, does a really great choose your own university with sliding scales based on what's important to you. I want a lot of Greek life. I want a lot of financial aid, whatever those scales are. It can help you identify one of more than 4,000 US four-year colleges. And just last week, Forbes put out a list of the new Ivies, which are both public and private institutions that over the last 5 years, employers say that they're 33% more likely to hire from than Ivy League schools, just because they note the grade inflation at Ivies, and they also note that those graduates tend to be more expensive and have higher expectations and so forth. In your conversations with families, or just in your work more broadly, what have been those conversations about saying, let's steer focus away from these highly rejective colleges that are in many ways creating this sociological bubble in which everyone's, intensifying effort and pressure, and start to focusing on those other schools that are really like colleges that change lives, for example, that really do make a difference for social mobility. Any observations there?
So so just to back up for a second, I went in search for this book for the kids who were doing well in these environments. And I wanted to know what they had in common. And I outline it all in the book. But one of the things they had were parents who were very clear about their definition of what a successful life is. And I think when we are not explicit with our kids about what we value, what our values are, and who are the adults in their lives who we think are living successful lives, then we are at the mercy of these, US News and World Report, which is manipulative at best. The young people that I talk to, I say, if you gather data and put out these scientific lists like US News and World Report, you would not do very well in your science class. It is manipulative. It was, so I break it down in the book. I have a whole section that I call Reject the Premise. So in answer to your question, I would say as parents and as educators, we need to zoom out and actually deflate the myth that the good life is found by going to a good college. It's just not true. I think enough adults know many people who went to these highly rejected schools whose lives did not turn out the way they'd hoped, and students who went to colleges we'd never even heard of whose lives turned out even better than they had imagined. So I think we need to be explicit with our kids about what it is that a successful life actually is for you in your family. And these conversations about what we value have been the most important conversations I've had with my kids, and pointing out to them the adults in their lives, including one of my very best friends who I think is the most professionally successful and personally successful person I've ever met. She went to a college in Ohio that I can't even pronounce. It begins with an M. It's like Masha, something like that. And she is and so for my kids to see that, to see people like my friend Katie and others in my community who I think are leading successful lives, who have great families, who are close with their kids, who have wonderful, deep relationships, who have work that's meaningful to them, that they are making an impact on the world, that these are the things that matter, not a logo. And so I think the conversations have to start sort of very big. And what is a successful life? How do we define it? Who are the people in our circle that we can point to who we think live successful lives? And not just model that, but actually be explicit with our kids about what we value. And so when we do that, the conversations about where we go to college are less about what is the rank on this fake list that US News and World Report puts out, and rather, what is the right fit for you? Where can you matter on this campus? Which schools? And so when I was touring with my now senior, we would go to the schools and it would be, how are you going to go to the school? What are the courses that interest you? What are the professors that you'd like to study with? Which extracurricular activities could you see yourself trying? Where do you think you'd spend your time on the weekends? What would you be doing in your off time? So again, less about a rank and more about the true value that is inherent in any college.
Lovely. I know that those kinds of conversations are ones that our independent education consultants in the audience most certainly value and try to have all the time with parents and with students as well. This really feels like it also is a good opportunity to move into, we had a question very early on from people saying, what are some of the ways we can mitigate these pressures or countermand this narrative. And one of the things that I very much appreciated about your book is it's in many ways easy to diagnose the problem. You had so many wonderful conversations that I think brought that problem to life very vividly for readers. But you also provide these evidence-based tips and practices for how to reinsert this authentic connection with your children or with your students. What are, if you had to think about what are the ways to sort of zoom out and to start having those conversations about value, or to demonstrate to students, to children, that they matter beyond whatever grade they bring home? It's just some of you have so many great examples, but what are some of the ones that stand out that you really want people to take away?
Yeah, I would say to start, I think everyone on this Zoom knows that one of the most important developmental tasks of adolescence is developing a strong sense of self. And what the researchers find in developing that sense of self is that the self becomes stronger, less by being praised, which can feel like pressure, and more for being known. So one of the ways that I think we as educators and parents could help our kids develop a strong sense of self that's not reliant on GPA and test scores is to get a PhD in them. That's how I phrase it in the book. Get to know who they are uniquely at their core. And one of the ways we can do this is very simply by having them take the VIA Strengths Survey. I don't know if you've ever come across that Values in Action Survey. It's a scientifically validated survey that you could find online. They have an adult version and a student version. And it was created by the two leading positive psychology researchers, Marty Seligman and Christopher Peterson. And it's a quick survey that helps you surface what are the strengths that are already inherent in you that that you could use to overcome obstacles, but also most likely to add value into the world. And so in our family, we took it as a family, and they allow you to print it out. And my daughter put it up on her wall. And when she encountered an issue, she would look on her character strengths, and I would say, which of these strengths could help you overcome that obstacle? So I'll give you just a silly example. In her cafeteria, she was in 7th grade when she took this, and there was a lot of drama going on in the 7th grade table. And she was complaining about it. And I said, okay, which of your strengths could you use to help you overcome that issue? And she said, oh, my humor. I can crack a joke. I could be sarcastic. And I will say she uses her humor to connect with people, to diffuse difficult situations, to cope with stress. And so anyway, one of the ways that we can help our students develop a sturdy sense of self that's not reliant on external validation is by getting to know them for who they uniquely are, and to help their parents get to know their students for who they are deep inside as well. Sorry, my throat
No
is
worries. I was actually going to
New York City. One of the other things that I think is critical for parents of young people, and I think there are ways that educators can employ these as well. I asked leading researcher Sunya Luthar, who until recently, she was one of the world's leading researchers on resilience in young people. I asked her, okay, if we know that achievement pressure, because she was studying this population, is putting our kids at risk, what can parents do tonight to really buffer against it? And she said a phrase which has really stuck with me. She said, minimize criticism, prioritize affection. So what does that mean? It means when our kids inevitably do things that we don't agree with, behave in ways that disappoint us, how we communicate our disappointment, to be clear about separating the deed from the doer. And in terms of prioritizing affection, for a parent, it's greeting your kids once a day the way the family dog greets you, with just total joy, right? So much of our lives as educators, as parents, is getting through an endless to-do list that our students and our kids don't often get to see the joy that we get from doing what we do. I mean, people go into the education sphere not to, buy the big mansion, but because they want to help raise and nurture the next generation. Let your students see, not necessarily through physical affection, but affection in your voice, in the way you interact with them, having conversations that have no agenda, finding ways to connect and being mindful of doing that, and starting there first. So minimizing criticism, prioritizing affection is one way of creating a kind of buffer from the endless messages that our kids are getting in the wider culture about who is most valued, the kids with the high GPAs, the kids on the A team, et cetera.
Mhm. That image is one that really stands out, actually, the greeting your kid once a day, like you greet the family dog. And it's such an easy thing to conjure, the way you would, ruffle their hair or kiss them on the cheek or whatever it is. Also, another wonderful researcher springs to mind, Shirzad Chamine, who is a lecturer at the Stanford B School, wrote a wonderful book called Positive Intelligence. And he tells this story about the way that he was trying to convey his love for his son. And he would ask his son, "Why do you think I love you?" And the kid would say, "Ah, because I'm smart." And he said, "That's not it." "Oh, because I'm funny?" "No, that's not it." "Because I'm kind?" "No, that's not it either." And basically, they would grind through all of these possibilities until he would finally say, "I love you because you're you." And that's something that I have taken in with my own littles, just to say, it has nothing to do with what you do. I love you for who you are unconditionally, which I know is one of the really wonderful positive messages woven through your book. Um, but
Just on
Shamina,
that, on that,
please.
on that quick, so a very wise mother that I met had two very high achieving kids who portrayed some perfectionistic tendencies. And so at home, she was really careful to try to buffer against that. And so when they would come home after studying for a test and not doing as well as they'd hoped, or trying out for a team that they didn't make, she would reach into her wallet and she would grab, let's say, a $20 bill. And she would say to her disappointed teenager, "Do you want this money?" And they would say, "Yes." And she would say, "Okay, hang on a minute." And she'd crumple it up. She'd put it on the floor. She would dunk it in a glass of water. And then she would hold up this soggy, dirty, wrinkled bill. And she would say to her kids, "Do you still want this money? Like this $20 bill, your value doesn't change, whether you've been cut from a team, whether you bomb a test, your value is your value no matter what." And that to me is just a great way of making the thinking around unconditional love really tangible and visible for young people.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I know that's another one of the great anecdotes and analogies that I recall from the book. Um, One of the other things that Shirzad mentions or that Shamin mentions in his research is, very often and he's much more about positive intelligence from a personal point of view, but of course, so much of what we are doing with children and with students is a reflection of what is happening internally for us. And so it's about creating these positive conversations about what we value, to your point. But he has this sliding scale between what he calls sages and saboteurs. And the sage will be the voice, sort of like a devil and an angel on your shoulder. The sage is the voice that is providing you with validation, which is pointing out all the great things that you do, all the successes and achievements and joys that you've had. Whereas the saboteur is the one that's saying you are not enough, or you did this wrong, or they're probably thinking this about you. And to view it as sort of this slide in between sage and saboteur, to identify which of these angels or devils is speaking to you at any one moment, was a good heuristic for identifying when that sort of negative self-talk would tend to emerge. And one of the reasons I bring this up, if we're talking about, great practices for students to be able to develop that sense of self and to be validated by what they do, there's a really wonderful thread of research coming out from UC Berkeley, from a psychologist who looked at what she calls counterfactual thinking. And basically, it's sitting down and asking children, how would things be different if you had chosen to go to a different college? or if you had chosen to do this differently. And this is one of those simple cognitive tricks that just make something click in people's heads to look back upon their experiences and to value them more and to say, regardless of whatever decisions were made, that's the decision, that's the path that I chose that led to where I am right now. Ultimately, that led to me being me. Things would have been very different if I'd gone down another path, but this is the sort of truth that I am standing in right now. And so that method of asking people, how would things have been different if you had done something else or if things had gone differently, tends to be a really effective way of getting people, children especially, to look on the bright side of things and feel more confident about what they've done before already. Um, I particularly love, as you know, we are, as I mentioned at the beginning, this community of researchers, getting a PhD in your child or your students. Um, and I think that that's one of those, you know, physical affection aside, that's one of those ways that we can really be present for young people. What are some of the specific tactics that you would suggest for people to get a PhD in a particular student? What lines of questioning have you found effective?
Yeah. So again, I would go online and look up the VIA survey. And I would, I mean, it's free and it's scientifically validated. I would have your students fill that out. I would also fill it out and maybe compare and contrast with your student. What were your top five character strengths? What are my five top character strengths? And talk about them. You know, another thing that I have found very helpful is teacher report cards. So, you know, not just looking at the grade, but you know, asking to see the students and how the teachers point out the strengths and really highlighting them and saying, I see this too. You know, whatever the teacher says, you know, like she said of one of my son's teachers said, he's always the first one to help a struggling student in our math class to help. And I said, I see this too. You're the same way with your siblings, or when I'm struggling with technology, you're always there to lend a helping hand. I love that about you. You know, one of the things that we do around our table, and I think this is something you could just do with your students, is point out one or two or three things about them that is unique about them that has nothing to do with performance. So it could be, I love how you're always asking such interesting, curious questions. You are not afraid to ask for follow-ups. You are so curious and you just want to dig into the research. I love that about you. And just helping them appreciate these intrinsic things that are deep inside of them and those strengths that are actually going to be useful in being a success. We spend so much of our time as parents and educators kind of scaffolding for the struggles. We all have what researchers call a negativity bias, where we notice the weaknesses much stronger. They make a much stronger impact than the positives do. But what we know about the real world, and frankly about the future that we're raising our kids in, is that it's their strengths that are going to be called upon to solve the world's problems. So I think one of the things that I learned in this book is to really zoom in on my kids' strengths. To really, it's interesting. One of the articles I wrote for the New York Times was about what college admissions officers talk about with their own kids. And it was, oh my gosh, I think I wrote it 8 years ago, 7 or 8, but it's still up on the New York Times if you go online. And I interviewed Stuart Schmel, who's at MIT, and his daughter was in high school at the time. And I said, how are you handling your own child's APs and extracurriculars? And he said, what I know about being a college admissions officer is that I want to know the student on this transcript. So do I need them to take APs in every subject? No. I need them to take advanced courses to dig in, put the energy and the time into the areas where their strengths are, that they know who they are and they know their strengths. That's what I want to see. So he said to his daughter, I can't remember I have it in the article, I can't remember if she was humanities or sciences, but whatever it was, he said, that's where I want you to take the advanced classes, in the areas of your strength. I don't want to see it across the board. And I'll say that was also true of the parents of the healthy achievers that I met. That these parents, I write about them in the book, they saw their role as not necessarily encouraging every pursuit of their students, but rather holding them back sometimes when they thought they were taking on too
Mm,
much. So many of the young people that I interviewed talked about how the really high achievers would sacrifice everything during the week, for their goals. And on the weekends, many of them told me they drank to black out. It was the play hard, work hard, play hard. And it was because they didn't know how to allow themselves time to decompress, time with family time, downtime. And the parents of the healthy strivers said that they believed that it was their job as parents while their kids were under their roof to teach them how to build a life that they will not need drugs and alcohol to escape from. So, a balanced life. Yes, take those advanced placement courses, do the extracurriculars in the areas that are interesting to you, but make sure that every day has some downtime, has some family time, has time together with friends, building those connections, helping our kids, even at a young age, build a kind of life that could be a model for the future.
Mm, that's such an important message. And it's actually
related to something that we've been speaking about internally from Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation. Specifically, he says, and this goes back to some of the points you made at the beginning, is the childhood that we remember. I grew up in rural Maine, so I spent a lot of time skipping rocks and looking for crabs and seaweed and stuff like that with my siblings. The childhood that we remember with a lot of undirected play, and time with friends, is harder won these days because everyone is so overscheduled. We're not developing in children or in young people these sort of auto executive skills that would allow them to say, what am I actually going to do with my own time this afternoon? Okay, well, I'll build a fort with my buddy. Like, what's that going to take? And all of the sort of very mundane in a sense, but very practical elements of planning and preparation that go into these undirected activities. Some of the questions that have bubbled to the top in the Q&A have been, given that a lot of students today struggle with things like executive functioning skills or time management, self-regulation, through all of your research and interviews, have you observed things about the role um, of that kind of skill development? Because it sounds like it's also related to the idea of building a life that's balanced, that has time for joy, time for downtime, time for friends and family, and then still making time for all of those rigorous activities, academic activities, like extracurricular activities, that matter to them.
Yeah. So I would say if you have a student or a child who is struggling with time management, with not getting the grades that they want to be getting, to get curious, not furious. Getting curious is, maybe there is a learning difference that's gone undiagnosed. Maybe they are not feeling a connection with their teacher, which can undermine performance. Maybe they don't have a sense of belonging or connection in the classroom, which could hijack important cognitive resources that should be spent studying. So really teaming up with your child, with your student, and saying, I know you want to do well. I mean, all students and all adults want to do well. We are wired to want to do well. So if a student is not doing well, get curious about it. Let's say, right, that you got curious, not furious, and you still didn't find anything. Then it would be, teaching them how work gets done. Some kids really have no concept. They have an assignment, they have an expectation, but they don't understand the middle. And I had
Mm.
one of the students living in my house. And so what I would do with him is I would greet him, after school or when I got home from work. And, I would say, did you have your downtime? Okay. Now let's go plug your phone in my room and let me sit down with you and let's create a game plan of what you want to get done and how much time you think each task is going to take you. And so teaching them how to do the deep work, teaching them just the basic skills of sitting at a clean desk as opposed to their beds or their floors with a bright light, just teaching kids how work gets done, good, healthy work habits. If we do that, then the good grades do come, right? It's teaching them how to do the work.
That is a great message. And I know one of the reasons that I have particularly enjoyed working at Polygence is our commitment to creating structures, not only for great learning skills like the reflective practices that we've been discussing, opportunities for ungraded failure so you can learn from your mistakes, but also the very practical sense of building those structures, those positive habits of hitting different milestones or breaking a big project down into digestible chunks that are really critical to students' success both in high school and beyond. So I'm really glad that you shared that. Um, we're coming close to the end of our time, and there's so much more that I would love to ask you about how mattering factors in the lives of adults. I know that you and I, in preparation for our conversation today, talked about those World Happiness Indexes that indicate that it's not just young people who are suffering. Tons of adults today are looking for meaning and struggling to find it in many ways. Um, there are some reflective practices suggested from Mark Brackett at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And so I'm wondering whether this is an opportunity that I can serve to you to address both of those things, to sort of conclude with that sort of those positive reflective practices and also talk about mattering as it will present in your forthcoming work too.
Oh, I would love to. So let me just quickly say that after mattering, one of the most important takeaways from the research on building the resilience of kids is to make sure that the number one intervention for any struggling student is to make sure the primary caregivers in that child's life, the parents, the educators, that their mental health, their support system is in check, because a child's resilience rests fundamentally on the resilience of the adults in their life. And adult resilience rests fundamentally on the depth and support of our relationships. And it wasn't that the parents and the educators in these high achieving communities, wasn't that they didn't have friends. It's that they often didn't have the time or emotional bandwidth to invest in those friendships so that they could be sources of support when needed. You know, we're often told, both as educators and as parents, to put our oxygen mask on first. But what I'm saying actually goes deeper. I'm saying find one or two or three people, friends in your life that you can open up with, that you could be vulnerable with, who know you, who can see when you are struggling, and who will reach over and put the oxygen mask on for you. That is, you know, the number one thing that we could do for our young people is to go upstream and to help the adults in their lives, because adults are suffering at the same rate as young people, and we're just not talking about it that way. I am writing a second book on adult mattering. And if anybody is interested, I have a survey on my website, jenniferbwallace.com. You can take the survey. It's an international survey. But I will conclude with the Mark Brackett reflective advice, which I have found to be very helpful, particularly this year with my senior who got his applications done, but maybe in a not as timely a way as I would have done them. And so instead of, you know, losing my patience, I thought about his advice, and it was this: in those moments when you are struggling with a student or your child, think of them 10 or 20 years from now. What is the story you want them to tell about their childhood and about their relationship with you? And then ask yourself if you're helping them tell that story.
Lovely. Jenny, this has just been a wonderful conversation.
We are so grateful for your time and for all of these insights. And I'm based on the commentary that's both in the chat and in the Q&A, I know that so many of our attendees have taken away not only great lessons, but also great tips. And as I say, it's something that we feel is really important to have people walk away with actionable things that they can do to make the lives of those around them better, including their own. So we're really grateful to you for that as well.
Well, thank you. And if you had questions that we didn't get to, I open my DMs in my Instagram from time to time. So feel free to DM me at Jennifer Breheny Wallace, and join us at the Mattering Movement. And just grateful. Thank you for all you do for young people.
Thank you. And thanks to all of our attendees
For joining us for this headline webinar of the spring webinar series. From all of us at Polygence, we appreciate you and what you do and are excited to support those young people in your lives. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.